The president and his businesses operated in the domain of New York. So this is a national race, and you need to treat it like that. People talk about people don't vote in big numbers other than presidential campaign. This is a presidential campaign, because the president is going to deal one way or another. I don't know if anything's there or not. Neither does Tish and others. But the president has got to deal with whatever the Attorney General objectively and in protection of the law does in state law. So there's a lot riding on this. And I think that it is important that we understand that. Our first candidate tonight, and I'm not saying this is the order it'll be next Thursday, this is the order it is tonight. So if you hear support different candidates, don't say I predicted anything. National Action Network does not endorse candidates. I do. And we'll get to that the next day or so. As Al Sharpton, I can do what I want. Kirsten Ford has already done what he wants. But the first candidate, one of the reasons she's here first is she has been part of NAN since NAN started. She comes out of Brooklyn, and I cannot think, I was thinking riding up here, of a fight that our community engaged in, she was not there. And she has been vocal, present, and has been to the House of Justice more times than most of you, and many of you, if not all, are members. So she still said, no, I'm coming, because I want to talk to the people and let them understand what I'm going to do, and then I want to encourage them to turn out. So I want to give you a young lady who has been the public advocate of New York, before that a member of the city council, and has been an activist, and has been an example to those that dealt with the fact that women were not given positions of power. Let me tell you, I know as a Brooklynite that it was not easy to fight even the progressive black men in Brooklyn to get where she got. Because she came at a time, even though she was young, that there still was this old man's club. As a kid, Shirley Chisholm had to fight it. And she had to pick up that banner. So it's with great pride we start tonight with the public advocate, candidate for governor, endorsed by, I won't say who, Letitia James.
In the history of this country. Yes. We're careening towards chaos and confusion. We're in the midst of a constitutional crisis. And what is propelling me forward is the fierce urgency of now. Because you see, all throughout this city and throughout this state, I've crisscrossed this state. I've been to Buffalo with lead poisoning. I've been to Albany where 8 black men have been shot. I've been to Syracuse. I've been to Rochester where there's housing issues and immigrants are being defrauded. I've been to Long Island and Brentwood and Dix Hills where individuals are engaging in environmental racism by dumping on these communities. And I've been here in the city of New York, where we've got a housing crisis, and NYCHA, unfortunately, is in a situation of benign neglect, no, intentional neglect.
Yes, yes.
And so what we need now more than ever in the Office of Attorney General is someone who understands all of these issues, but also understands that we need to have someone who is a fighter, who has consistently and repeatedly stood up and spoken truth to power, regardless of the circumstances. And so whether or not it's corruption in Washington or in Albany, it really doesn't matter. What we need is someone who can follow the evidence and follow the facts. And so as the next Attorney General of the state of New York, I look forward to joining all of you as we investigate corruption, as we take on this illegitimate president. As we follow his money. As we investigate how he engaged in self-enrichment. As we investigate his ties, his purported ties to Russia and to China. How a man who was once almost bankrupt became flush with money despite the fact that domestic banks weren't loaning him any money. How we all of a sudden decided to purchase all of these real estate holdings, including some golf courses. And how he unfortunately refuses to recognize or even acknowledge our security interests and instead is recognizing and crediting the words of a dictator, an autocrat, Mr. Putin. And so there are a number of investigations. Last count, there are at least 100 investigations against this president. Yeah. From Mueller to the Southern District, to the FBI, to the Attorney Generals. There's multi-state coalitions against this president, and the walls are closing in on him. And could you imagine, my friends, if on the day after the election, right, a man who refuses to denounce white racists and white supremacists, as he wakes up at 5 o'clock in the morning to start his Twitter storm. Could you imagine if he sees the face of Letitia James as the next attorney? Could you imagine that tweet? To focus on corruption, my friends, because in the past decade, 30 elected officials in Albany have engaged in the perp walk, indicted or suspended or disciplined. And so they can't escape the scrutiny of the Attorney General of the state of New York, particularly when they're engaging in graft and when they're using public funds to serve them and them only. And so we've got to root out corruption wherever it leads. And no stone will be unturned. We also have to focus on the environment because there's too many children who are dying of asthma. Too many children who are breathing dirty air, dirty water, dirty energy. And so we've got to enforce the environmental laws. We also have to focus on, in the Office of Public Advocate, you know, I released the worst landlord list. We got to give it life. We got to give it life. And so those landlords that we were able to get arrested working with the district attorneys here, there was only about 2 or 3. We need to make sure that landlords know that there's a new attorney general in office in the state of New York who takes housing laws very seriously. And it's time that they not engage in harassment or abuse or constructive eviction of individuals, particularly seniors and particularly women with children. So it won't be tolerated anymore. Zero tolerance policy for slumlords. So let that message go out all throughout the state of New York, because what we need to invest in, obviously, is building affordable housing and building schools and building bodies as opposed to building jails. And let's talk a little bit about mass incarceration. As someone who represented individuals in the criminal justice system and represented a significant number of young people in the criminal justice system, we've got to divert individuals who are suffering from mental illness, and poverty should not be a crime. We've got to end cash bail. We've got to make sure that we don't do trials by ambush. We got to reform discovery in the state of New York. We need alternatives to incarceration. We need to end and close Rikers Island, right? We need to make sure that non-violent and offenses people are given consideration. We need to make sure that we have the second chance programs, because there's individuals walking all throughout the state of New York with warrants for relatively minor offenses that need to be addressed in the city of New York. And they need to be addressed in communities where individuals know one another and in places where they feel comfortable. We need to make sure that individuals who unfortunately die at the hands of police officers, that those cases are brought to justice in a timely fashion, and that there's accountability and transparency. And we need to make sure that we respect one another, and we respect the humanity of all individuals. And then lastly, before we begin to take questions, let me just say that as the next Attorney General, you know there's scams out here. And so individuals are engaging in a wide range of scams. And the next crisis around the corner is student debt. Just like with the housing crisis, it was mortgage lenders. Now it's those who service those mortgages, who are imposing late fees and not applying credits, and student loans, obviously, that are being securitized and sold. And that's why your children are still at home with you, because they're carrying all of this debt. And that is the next crisis around the corner. And so we've got to investigate those servicers, and we've got to investigate, obviously, all of those individuals who provide too much debt to students. And then we've got to abolish ICE, because ICE is in our courtrooms. And there should be one system of justice, and immigrants should not be afraid to enter into our courthouses because they're afraid of being detained. Individuals who go into our courthouses who are seeking orders of protection and are now afraid. That really should not be the case. ICE should be abolished, but we should create a new organization to focus on those issues that ICE has under its jurisdiction. But those areas where they're basically intimidating and detaining individuals who are seeking justice, we need to do away with that. Let me also, as I close, say that the next Attorney General of the state of New York will continue to provide access. And there will be regional offices that will remain open and provide assistance to individuals. And it's important that everyone understand that most of what the Attorney General does is representing state agencies. But they do engage in pattern and practice and affirmative litigation. They also enforce the law, and they also engage in advocacy. And so we will continue as the next Attorney General focusing on advocacy and focusing on affirmative litigation and standing up for a countless number of individuals who basically seek justice. You see, I'm a proud graduate of a school which was responsible for engineering the civil rights movement. I'm a proud graduate of Howard University School of Law. And it was there that I learned about the powers of the Constitution. It was there that I learned that the law is both a sword and a shield. It was there that where I recognized and understood that the law applies to all of us equally. Equal justice under the law. And it was there that I fell in love with the concept of sweet justice. And it's that concept that's going to carry me into the office of Attorney General. It's that concept and that principle and those values and the notion that no one is above the law and no one is below the law. And so as a former city council member, as a former public defender, as a former assistant attorney general, and now as the public advocate of the city of New York, and soon to be 1 week from tomorrow, the Attorney General of the state of New York, I urge all of you to get your friends out, to call all of your family members from Buffalo all the way to Long Island and urge them to vote and remind them of what's at stake. And what's at stake is our basic freedom and our basic democracy. And the law has been the firmest pillar of our democracy. And right now, my friends, our democracy is under attack. And when you are under attack, what do? You stand up and you fight back. And so let's fight back together, and let's demonstrate to all of those individuals which underestimate me and have underestimated me all of my life. And each and every time I've overperformed, that will continue to come at me and criticize me, that will continue to throw things at me. But let them know that I stand with all of you who recognize the concept of sweet justice, which is part of who she is, part of her fabric, part of her DNA, and part of her breathing, part of her life, and all that she lives and breathes. So I thank you. I want to thank the great Reverend Sharpton for all that he's done. I want to thank him for allowing me to say a few words, because this really is a hollow space. And this is a space where you speak to people and you talk about the issues that people care about. And you speak truth to power. And so I do not take this moment lightly. And I want you to know that after Thursday, when we become the next Attorney General, I look forward to coming back and joining with you in this celebration as we celebrate sweet justice. Sweet justice. God bless you and thank you.
Thank you, Madam Public Advocate. As has been agreed to by all of the candidates, there will be a couple of questions that have been pre-screened. The first question, we've been joined by many mothers of the movement, mothers that stand, the family members, mothers, sisters, families. If you would stand, please, thank you. The executive order that was signed by the governor gives the Attorney General the right to investigate police shootings of unarmed individuals. There's been many concerns that it's not codified into law, but as Attorney General, you would have the standing to continue these investigations and pursue them. Would you be able to commit to these families and to the community that as Attorney General, you will be as vigorous as you've been as a public advocate in standing up and defending innocent victims of police aggression?
Yeah. As most of you know, when we saw the death of Eric Garner, and we recognize that our eyes don't lie, as most of you know, I went to court to seek the grand jury minutes in the Eric Garner case, but was unsuccessful. And as most of you know, I prepared a letter to the then Attorney General Eric Schneiderman, urging him and the governor, and wrote a letter to the governor of the state of New York, urging that he issue an executive order appointing the Attorney General as the special prosecutor. That law needs to be obviously codified, and that law needs to be expanded. And so it's really critically important that the Attorney General investigate the death of individuals at the hands of police and do it independently, and do it without any, without any cooperation from the local precinct, that we provide transparency, that there's accountability, and that we respond and we communicate to the family in question. Because oftentimes what I understand is that these families, the questions that they have, oftentimes they're not answered, and no one responds to them. And there's no accountability, and a lot of information that they seek is oftentimes withheld. And all that they are seeking, and all that I am seeking, all that I have been seeking, is again, respect and accountability and answers. That's all that they are asking for. Nothing more and nothing less. And so it's really critically important that we enforce the law in the state of New York, but that law be broadened and strengthened and codified in law, so that the executive order will not expire and that it's built into the law of the state of New York.
The next question is from our very own Queen Mother Blakely. There are serious issues regarding predatory lenders and mortgage fraud and deed theft, and so many of our most long-standing community leaders and residents who've been here for generations are finding themselves out of their home that they've owned from one generation to the next due to deed theft and predatory practices. What, as the Attorney General, can you do and do you intend to do to protect some of our most vulnerable from these predatory lenders and practitioners and those who are stealing deeds?
As a former Assistant Attorney General, I worked with the Civil Rights Bureau in the Attorney General's office to bring a case against Delta funding that preyed upon primarily minority homeowners in the borough of Brooklyn. We were able to reach a settlement and get some relief for those residents and for those families. And as the next Attorney General of the state of New York, I will increase and expand the Civil Rights Bureau to focus on these abuses. As a public advocate of the city of New York, we work very closely with regards to the issue of deed theft, which is occurring all over the city of New York. We work with the City Council to draft some legislation, which is now passed, but I think it's really critically important that we continue to work all throughout the state of New York because deed theft is a reality. And as I mentioned in my remarks, the next crisis around the corner is not just mortgage lenders, but individuals who service those loans, who harass tenants, who harass individuals, homeowners, who send out dunning letters, who impose fees and who do not give credits to homeowners. And then as a result of that, go after them in terms of collection practices, illegal collection practices. So deceptive business practices continue. And so that's why any settlement that the Office of Attorney General engages in, it's really critically important that that money not be siphoned to the general fund, that the Attorney General can use those funds to address these issues and to provide legal assistance to New Yorkers all throughout the state of New York. And so I plan on working with legal services all throughout the state of New York. I've had a number of discussions already with legal services in Buffalo, in Syracuse, in Rochester, in Albany, in Hudson, on Long Island, about issues on the ground. And I look forward to using settlement monies as we go against servicers and as we go against individuals who prey upon students and offering them student loans at high rates. And particularly universities such as that Trump University, universities where they give you degrees and the degrees are absolutely worthless. These for-profit universities that continue to exist and prey upon low-income individuals, we're going to go after them. And we're going to make sure that justice is had for those individuals. Because so many individuals, the reason why we are having an economic crisis is that individuals are laden with debt. And it affects their credit score. And it affects their ability to make ends meet. And so we need to use executive law deceptive business practices to go after these individuals and deceptive marketing practices and deceptive advertising to go after these businesses, and particularly when they prey upon low-income people, people of color, all throughout the state of New York. I did it as a former Assistant Attorney General, and I will do it as the next Attorney General, but the next Attorney General will be doing it in high heels.
Stole the thunder out of my next question. Public Advocate James, you were one of the first watch women on the tower and on the wall raising the issue of lead poisoning in NYCHA. You were out there in the very beginning of this. You likened the crisis to what we saw in Flint. And indeed, your dire predictions have panned out, unfortunately, to be more truthful than many of us had hoped. As the Attorney General, you will have some ability to investigate. Many people have asked us why we're not calling for indictments and why we're not calling for criminal investigations of the people that had the knowledge and mishandled the truth. And I'm not suggesting that you should do that, but as the Attorney General, bless you, as the Attorney General, do you see within your purview and your scope oversight of NYCHA as part of your responsibility?
So as most of you know, I was the first one to call for the resignation of the head of NYCHA, and she did step down. But just calling for the change in leadership means nothing if you don't have systematic change from the ground up. And it's also important to know that all throughout the state of New York, NYCHA is just one public housing authority that has its problems. There's lead poisoning in Albany, Buffalo, In Newburgh, they are filing a lawsuit against the EPA because their water has also been tainted and has been poisoned. And so there are environmental issues all up and down the thruway. But NYCHA, given the fact that there are over 500,000 families, most of them seniors with children, is especially acute. Lead paint, mold, elevators that don't work, rodent infestation, no paint, no hot water, no heat. We filed a lawsuit in the Office of Public Advocate when individuals were denied heat. And so it's really critically important that we will use the law in the state of New York to bring some relief to the residents of public housing all throughout the state of New York. But we also are urging, we also will be notifying the city of New York that there will be a full investigation with respect to the operations of public housing in the city of New York. Because we believe that there's a lot of waste, a lot of corruption, and that we are doing a disservice to the residents of public housing in the city of New York. I know too many of the families of public housing. I know too many of them who basically want the same things that you and I want, and that is to have a safe home with heat and hot water, individuals who pay their rent on time. And they don't want to have to come home to elevators that don't work, and they don't want to have to come home to more lead. And so they deserve that. And although people claim that it's because the federal government has disinvested from public housing, and that is true, the reality is we've got to put pressure both on the city of New York and the state of New York to step up and to invest in public housing. You want the votes in public housing, you got to invest in public housing. And you got to respect the individuals who currently live there. You just cannot come around during campaign time. You need to come around and check on them at each and every occasion. And that's what's really critically important. And as someone who represented downtown Brooklyn, Fort Greene, and Clinton Hill, I remember the residents of Ingersoll and Whitman and Farragut and Atlantic Terminal and Marcy and Tompkins. I met with them regularly. And I respect them. And as the next Attorney General of the state of New York, I'm going to make sure that the law is on their side, and we will get justice for those residents.
Thank you. They promised me we had you for a couple more minutes, so I'm going to ask you. You and I have stood together on the issue of gun violence, challenging Wall Street. You have taken a leadership role. As a public advocate, you have an appointment on the pension board, and you have taken a leadership role in trying to bring corporate America to account for the issue of guns. As the Attorney General, you would be charged to enforce our state gun laws, and you additionally would have a larger microphone to be able to advance the causes of gun reform and gun control. Could you tell us a little bit about what your agenda, gun control and gun violence agenda would be as Attorney General?
The NRA holds itself out as a charitable organization. But we all know that the NRA is nothing more than a terrorist organization. And so we need to go after this charitable organization. And the Office of Attorney General has a charities bureau that it can investigate these organizations to determine whether or not they're serving our charitable function. And that is on my list. Because one of the worst things about being a public official is I've had to attend too many funerals in my lifetime. I had to hold too many mothers, too many grandmothers. I had to cry before too many caskets. Too many children die prematurely as a result of a gun.
Yes.
And we need to form and join with a multi-state coalition of attorney generals and go after those states which have lax gun laws, because they come up on the I-85 and I-87, and they're basically concentrated in communities of color. We also need to make sure that we stand with Barbara Underwood and others, because you know there is a ridiculous effort this president, this illegitimate president, would allow individuals to print online and produce what they call these three-dimensional guns. That's crazy. And so we've got to make sure that we defend that injunction which currently exists, and any individual that is printing online those three-dimensional guns, we need to prosecute that individual to the fullest extent of the law. Right? We also need to make sure that we defend and expand the SAFE Act, which is the gun control law in the state of New York. And there are some individuals who are running for the office of Attorney General who have flip-flopped on that issue. Some who come from a family of guns, and at one point in time, when they were running for a different office, said that, you know, they like guns. Well, I don't like guns. And I believe, and when it comes to the First Amendment, it ends at the brunt of a gun. And so it's really critically important that we put forth efforts to tax bullets, to track bullets, do whatever we can to stop the proliferation of these products of death in our community, and continue to broaden and expand the SAFE Act and protect children and mothers and grandmothers who simply want to walk the street. And last but not least, we need to go after those individuals who are members of our gangs. And we've got a gang problem. And we need to invest in those organizations that are preventing gun violence. The SNUG program needs more investment. And in Albany, when I talked to you about the death of 8 black men, one gentleman was a member of SNUG. And he was breaking up a fight, and he was shot and killed. I met his father at the church in Albany. We need to expand the SNUG program and all those interrupters of crime on our streets, and promote them and provide them with resources. These are men and women who know the community, know the streets, and we need to support them in their effort to bring peace to our community. And I respect them greatly, and I thank them for all the work that they are doing, in addition to the members of NYPD. So NRA, we're going after them with all the tools that we have at our disposal to shut them down, to bankrupt them, to challenge them, and all the individuals who invest in NRA. Your reputational risks are in jeopardy. And so all of those banks and all of the individuals who fund them will be put on notice that if you continue to fund the NRA, that the next Attorney General will be coming after you as well.
All right, well, she's taken every question we've asked, as she always has, and now she's got to go out. She's got a big state to campaign. Let's give our public advocate, Letitia James, a round of applause and thank her. We asked in the beginning if you would abide by our rules, right? Because in the House of Justice, we set rules, and we don't allow those rules to be violated. So if you have a question, please write it down, and we'll make sure that the candidates address that. But we're not going to allow our candidates and our guests to be disrespected. We established the rules in the beginning. We would ask that you abide by the rules, and we'll make sure. Well, then we'll get to your question. Maybe we have a lot of folks here, but we're not going to allow our candidates to be and our guests to be disrespected. Thank you. Please continue.
Thank you.
Thank you.
My faith in the Constitution is full. It's complete. And it's whole. And I will not sit idly by and allow anyone to subvert the law. Those are not my words. Those are the words of the great Barbara Jordan. Barbara Jordan, who appeared and who was at the impeachment hearing of Richard Nixon. It's interesting how history is repeating itself, right? And so I stand before you in the spirit of Barbara Jordan. I stand before you in the spirit of Shirley Chisholm, who's unbossed and unbarred. And I will not allow anyone to question my independence and my 20 years of public service, where I have focused and dedicated my life to serving others, because government and public service transformed my life. You see, I come before you with a humble beginning. My mother scrubbed floors. My father was a maintenance man. I come before you as one of 8. Some made it and some didn't. But I've come before you as someone who scratched and clawed and fought and yelled and screamed to get to this place. And I'm not going to allow anyone to question my integrity or to question my independence. Because there are children dying in New York City. And there's children being poisoned in New York City. And upstate New York people are dying as a result of gun violence and environmental issues and housing issues and corruption issues and deceptive issues and immigrants who are hiding today in the shadows, afraid to go to school and afraid to go to work. I will not allow anyone to take my attention away from the issues at hand. It's really the fierce urgency of now. And now is the moment, my friends, where I urge all of you, next Thursday, to get your friends out and to march in quiet defiance as you march to the polls. And when you march to the polls in quiet defiance, remember why we're voting. Remember what's at stake. Remember all of those who died for the right to vote. And remember that our democracy right now, the greatest threat to our democracy is a man who is in Washington, D.C. And all that he represents is abhorrent to all of us. And what we've got to do is send a message to him that no one is above the law, and that the law is paramount, and that the next Attorney General of the state of New York will join all of those other investigations and ultimately bring him to sweet justice. Thank you and God bless you.
Public advocate, Tish James. Let me, as we move on, let me acknowledge the presence of one of our campaign chairs who's helping to run the campaign, who did 90 days. Well, I did 90 days, he did 50 in jail for protesting the Navy bombing in Vieques. Roberto Ramirez is in the house. And if you wanna, I don't know how many of y'all been to jail, but if you go to jail, federal jail, because we had protested at a Navy base in Vieques, Puerto Rico, and they strip search you in the morning and night. And there's something about getting to see each other naked twice a day that makes you close. And there was a lot more of me naked then. I'll just leave it like that. Ashley's waving, move on, Dad, move on. One of the things that I think is important to understand is that this Attorney General race, I was sitting thinking as Tish was talking, and as I said, she and I come out of Brooklyn. When I was growing up in Brooklyn, there was an Attorney General named Louis Lefkowitz. And there, at that time, you would never have imagined that 3 women, 1 LGBTQ man, blacks, you'd never seen this kind of ticket as possible in my lifetime. And that's one of the reasons why we need to vote because there's some representation there of people that have had to face discrimination and denial for different reasons. And one of the things that we advocate in NAN is we fight for everybody. You know, some folks think that you only should fight in one area. You've got to fight for everybody's civil rights to protect anyone's civil rights. And that's what we want these forums to represent. Let me also say, I understand that people are passionate about their question if they're not asked. She's a member, a good member, but we're trying to do this in the order in which they have laid out Minister Foy and Minister McCall and Katrina and Reverend Marshall. So what we're doing is to respect our young leaders that are coming on, taking the leadership here in NAN, because I've always said I want to build the next generation, so I want them to coordinate it, and they have, Isabel and others, Brandon and others, because I want them to be able to do leadership, because nobody's going to last forever. And we want to prepare this. I hope you will respect their procedures. In the old guard, when I was running things, you know it would be different. I'd have went off on you if you jumped up in my form. But Kirsten is not me, and he's calm and all of that. But you know, about 10 years ago, well anyhow. But I want you to understand she's a member and passionate, and all of you are passionate about your questions, but try to respect the process. And there's no question, written or not, that's not out of order. There are real concerns. So don't misinterpret people's passion. That is why they are here. It's because they're concerned. So don't look down on somebody for being concerned. Look down on you if you're not concerned. Am I right? All right. I want, as we prepare the next candidate to come, Attorney Hardy, to break down what the Attorney General's office is. Because I don't want everybody to assume that they know what Attorney Generals do and what their purview is. So as you listen to Tish James and you listen to all the other three, you know what you're gauging on what their possibilities are. And she's right, some of them are not going to touch issues. You remember that too. Because if they didn't mention it, it may not be their priority and it's yours. So that helps guide you as well. Is that not right? All right, let us hear from the Executive Vice President, General Counsel, and the moderator of Saturday Morning Rally, Attorney Michael A. Hardy.
Well, good evening, brothers and sisters. No justice. No peace. All right. Well, you know, a lot of people say I'm the people's attorney, but we know that task really belongs to the Attorney General of the state of New York, because they are the attorney for the state of New York, and many have looked to them as the people that truly represent all of the interests of the people of the state of New York. How many of you have ever been to the Attorney General's website? See, now, almost every hand should be raised, because whether you're dealing in criminal justice, whether you're dealing in consumer issues, in other words, whether you've had consumer problems, whether you're dealing with New York State student debt, whether you're dealing with charity issues, the Attorney General's office is involved. So they are in all of those issues, and basically, again, they are the attorney for the state of New York. So that's the general part. So more formally, of course, the Attorney General is a officer, a constitutional officer of the state of New York, and by and large their powers are as follows. So this won't be as exciting as the 2 minutes you just heard. but it'll be precise. The Attorney General of the State of New York can prosecute and defend all actions and proceedings which the state is interested and have charge and control of the legal business of the departments and bureaus of the state or any office thereof, which requires the services of attorney or counsel in order to protect the interest of the state. But this section, and there's some exceptions that are not really germane, and it goes, no action or proceeding affecting the property or interest of the state may be instituted, defended, or conducted by any department, bureau, board, council, officer, agency, instrumentality, without the notice to the Attorney General appraising him of said action or proceeding, the nature and purpose thereof, or that may participate to join therein in his opinion. Now, some of you all who attend legal night always comes with issues where you're mad at the governor, you're mad at some state official, and you want to sue them for doing the wrong that may or may not have happened to you and that you believe they're responsible for. Well, if you sue the state of New York, the Attorney General will be the attorney that represents them. In addition, whenever required by the governor, attend in person or by one of his deputies any term of the Supreme Court or appear before the grand jury thereof for the purposes of managing and conducting in such court or before such jury criminal actions or proceedings as shall be specified when required. In which case the Attorney General or his deputy so attending shall exercise all powers and perform all duties in respect to such actions and proceedings which the district attorney would otherwise be authorized or required to exercise. And and I didn't read all of it, but in a nutshell, there are situations, and some of you may remember a very famous one which involved a death penalty situation where, New York State, after 1994, for a very, very brief moment, had reinstituted the death penalty in the state. And again, while many of us had many disagreements with some of the district attorneys, one of the district attorneys in the Bronx, Robert Johnson at the time, made it unequivocal that it was not going to be the position of his office to institute the death penalty in any situation. And of course, there was a potential death penalty situation that came up, and at that time, the governor and the Attorney General moved to substitute and take jurisdiction over the case from Robert Johnson, who was the Bronx District Attorney at the time. So it's a very broad and wielding power. In addition, upon the request of the governor, the comptroller, Secretary of State, Commissioner of Transportation, so on, and it lists a whole another section of financial services, the Commissioner of Taxation and Finance, Commissioner of Motor Vehicles, or the State Inspector General, or the head of any department, authority, division, agency of the state investigate the alleged commission of any indictable offense or offenses that violate the law of the state. The officers making the request is especially required to execute or in relation to any matters connected with such department and to prosecute the persons or persons believed to have committed the same and any crime or office arising out of such investigation or prosecution or both, including but not limited to appearing before and presenting such matters to a grand jury. It also requires that the Attorney General cause all persons indicted for corrupting or attempting to corrupt any member or members of the legislature or the Commissioner of General Service to be brought to trial. And then there are just two more very specific sections that you should be aware of. One is whenever in the judgment the public interest requires it, the Attorney General may, with the approval of the Governor, and when directed by the Governor, shall inquire into matters concerning the public peace, public safety, and public justice. For such purpose, he may, in his discretion, without civil service examination, appoint people to help him carry that out. Also, prosecute every person charged with the commission of a criminal offense in violation of any of the laws of the state against discrimination because of race, creed, color, or national origin in any case where, in his judgment, because of the extent of the offense, such prosecution cannot be effectively carried out by the district attorney or the county wherein the offense or a portion thereof is alleged to have been commenced, or where, in his judgment, the district attorney has erroneously failed or refused to prosecute. In all such proceedings, the Attorney General may appear in person or as deputy or assistant in any court and any grand jury and exercise all the powers and perform all the duties with respect to such actions. And that's, again, a little bit of what I was describing to you just a moment ago. And then lastly, whenever any person shall engage in repeated fraudulent or illegal acts or otherwise demonstrate persistent fraud or illegality in carrying on, conducting, or transacting of business, the Attorney General may apply in the name of the people of the state of New York to the Supreme Court of the state on notice of 5 days for an order enjoining the continuance of such business activity. So in many, many respects, if you do right, you'll be on the right side of the Attorney General, and if you do wrong, you will see him in court, in which case you can call our crisis director, Reverend Kevin McCall.
Attorney Hardy said, see him. There are 3 women running. You might be seeing her, Attorney Hardy. I heard Attorney Hardy say they call him the people's attorney. That's usually somebody that does not intend to pay you for handling their case, Attorney Hardy. Which is most of the cases you handle, but that's another forum, another night. Our second candidate tonight, I've known most of her life. She comes out of a civil rights, political empowerment family. Her father was Deputy Speaker Arthur Eve in Buffalo. Her father is, not was. And she has served as a senior policy advisor to President Bill Clinton. She was on the staff for Senator Hillary Clinton, worked on the staff of the state of New York under Governor Andrew Cuomo. I'm on my second Cuomo, I'll get them mixed up. And she's Vice President of Government Affairs for Verizon. She is a neighbor, lives near the House of Justice, comes here, and we are happy to bring to you now candidate for Attorney General, State of New York, Alicia Eve.
Thank you so much, Reverend Sharpton. And thank you to all of you in the audience, the mothers of the movement, families, and the families who are here, and those of you who are listening and watching online. I stand before you proudly as a black woman, proudly as a daughter of this state whose roots in this state run deep, and proudly as the most qualified, most experienced,
most prepared candidate to take on the extraordinary challenges that our communities and our state are facing right now. As was mentioned, I'm the daughter of Arthur Eve and an extraordinary woman named Constance. My mother did have something to do with me being in this world. My father was one of the most prolific and progressive state legislators this state has ever known. As a freshman member of the Assembly in 1967, without the party's endorsement, I might add, he introduced legislation which became the law of the state that created the EOP and the HEOP programs, through which more than 100,000 of black and brown people across the city and across the state have gone on to college who otherwise might not have been able to go. My mother taught for 33 years and in her retirement founded what became the largest and most comprehensive alternatives to incarceration for women in the state's history. So I know what good public servants can do to transform lives and to transform communities. And I stand before you on their shoulders, ready to carry on the legacy. I said that I am running as the most qualified and most prepared candidate, so let me tell you a little bit about myself. Product of the Buffalo Public Schools, a graduate of Smith College, the John F. Kennedy School of Government, and the Harvard Law School. Yes, I went to Harvard Law School with someone named Barack and someone named Michelle. And I'm proud that among the many people across the state and across the country who are supporting my candidacy is one of the finest legal minds of our time, Dr. Charles Ogletree, also known as Tree. My first job out of Harvard Law School was clerking for the first African American to serve a full term on the state's highest court, the Honorable Fritz W. Alexander, who called New York State home. So right out of the gate, right out of law school, I'm having conversations with judges on the state's highest court about the most fundamental legal issues of our time, based upon the state statute and the state's constitution. I have been a proud litigator for 28 years, with more courtroom experience across this state than any other candidate by far. No one else even close. No one else even close. But the case that I'm most proud of is the case that I commenced when I was 29 years old, 25 years ago. I was a young attorney at a firm called Covington & Burling in Washington, D.C., and I represented, with 3 other young women associates on a pro bono basis, every single woman incarcerated in the District of Columbia prisons against the District of Columbia because of prison conditions they were living in. Our clients felt compelled to give sexual favors to prison guards to be able to have a guarantee to see their children on visiting day. I was in charge of the obstetrical gynecological care part of the case. One of my clients had her legs shackled to a hospital bed as she brought a child into this world. This is in the nation's capital, the most powerful nation on earth. And that was the inhumane treatment of so many women, particularly women of color. But I just didn't talk about it. I just didn't issue a press release. I didn't go on television. I certainly didn't talk about it in the classroom. I filed suit and I stopped it. I filed suit. I fought hard. Worked in the trenches, out of the limelight. Worked in the trenches, giving voice to hundreds of mostly black women in the nation's capital's prison. And I am proud to say I stayed the course, and we won. In that case, 25 years later, stands as a seminal case in terms of prison reform with respect to women prisoners, particularly to this day. Proudly served as a counsel to Joe Biden when he was a top Democrat on the Senate Judiciary Committee, helping him implement positive immigration reform. My primary task was helping him to implement the Violence Against Women Act, which he authored, working with hundreds of lawyers and organizations across the country whose sole mission was to support survivors of domestic violence and physical assault. Later, I proudly served as the first Senate counsel and the Homeland Security Advisor to the Honorable Hillary Rodham Clinton for 4.5 years, fighting in the trenches with Hillary to combat gun violence, fighting in the trenches with Hillary to advance pay equity, to advance women's rights, to advance reproductive rights, to advance civil rights, to advance voting rights. I work with many organizations across the state and across the country to craft the Kennedy Road Act, which had felon reenfranchisement for the nation, early voting for the nation, election day registration for the nation. The New York Times not only talked about this legislation, it editorialized it as a gold standard for election reform that should be the law of our land. Later served as the first woman and the first person of color to be the Chief Economic Development Advisor to a governor of the state in the state's history, overseeing 11 agencies in state government, from tax and finance to Empire State Development, ag and markets, the banking system. When I left the governor's office 5 years ago, we know how this works. When I had the job, I oversaw 11 agencies in state government. When I left, they slipped my job and gave it to 2 different people. But I took care of business as the first woman and as the first person of color to be the Chief Economic Development Advisor to a governor of the state in the state's history. And now, although I'm on a voluntary unpaid leave of absence, I am a senior executive in a company that employs 20,000 people with good paying jobs each and every day. And last but certainly not least, because public service has always been in my heart, I'm the first black woman to be a commissioner of the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, as vice chair of the Finance Committee, overseeing a $32 billion capital budget, and as chair of the Security Committee. I am best prepared to deal with extraordinary challenges that we are facing. And they are extraordinary. I have never witnessed anything like this in my 54 years on earth. We have a president of the United States who is seeking to roll back every single thing that so many of our predecessors fought so hard, in some cases died, for us to achieve. And I am best prepared to not only fight, but I know how to fight and to win. But I also have the experience and the unmatched commitment to all the people of this state to address the challenges that we have at home. And if we're going to be honest, a lot of our challenges, they predate Donald Trump. The fact that we have an unfair criminal justice system, that predates Donald Trump, and that is on us. The fact that we have too much gun violence in our streets. The women behind me, they understand this more than anyone. But none of us is immune. I had a nephew who was shot. They still don't know, years later, who did it. I'm fortunate that he is still with me. But one of my opponents talked about being opposed to the SAFE Act. She didn't like the process. Excuse me. Excuse me. Thousands of people in our community are now dead because of gun violence. I don't care if the bill was passed in 1 nanosecond. It was the right thing to do to have the toughest gun laws in this nation. But we have more to do. We have more to do to guarantee quality, affordable housing for people across our communities, and housing where they're not dealing with lead paint. My father offered the lead paint law, and decades later, we still have slum landlords who are taking New Yorkers for a ride, and we still have babies in our community who are suffering permanent brain damage because of violations of the law by some landlords. In the case of New York City, complicity by the city of New York with respect to the poisoning of our children. We have so much more work to do in terms of immigrant rights. I am the granddaughter of someone who was born in Puerto Plata, the Dominican Republic, moved to the Bronx, and my father, 85 years of age, was actually born in Harlem, where I have called home for many years. But we have so much more to do, particularly in the face of Donald Trump, to ensure that those who are living in the shadows come out of it and who are not living in fear. And I have said this over and over again. I don't care if you've been in this state 100 years or you have been here 1 day. As Attorney General, I will use every fiber of my being to protect and defend and empower you. Because that's what we are as a people, that's what we are as a state, and that's what we are, who we are as Americans. I am so humbled to stand before you as a candidate, to be the chief legal officer of our state. And one of the reasons why I'm able to stand here, and I'm the only candidate who is talking about this issue, criminal justice reform, housing reform, voting rights, civil rights, reproductive rights, women's rights. I'm the only candidate, however, who is talking about the fact that we have an education system that does not treat our children and give them what the state's highest court that I proudly worked for 2 years told them was their constitutional right. And that is a right under the state's constitution to a sound, basic education. I stand before you, yes, I'm proud I went to Harvard Law School with Barack and Michelle, but I am most proud that the foundation for me being able to graduate from Harvard Law School was that I had a quality basic education. And even as a child, I sensed that so many people that I knew that I was growing up with, who were smarter than I was, did not have the quality education I had. So we have so many challenges. We need to make our criminal justice system more fair. I support the legalization of marijuana. I support the expungement of every person who has a conviction on their record for recreational use of marijuana. Because we know our kids get picked up and other people's kids do not. I support the closing of Rikers Island. And we are a great state. We should be able to do this in less than 10 years. And as Attorney General, I will ensure that that happens. I support the elimination of cash bail. I will be the most fierce investigator and prosecutor of prosecutorial misconduct by those who are charged with overseeing our criminal justice system. Whether you are a district attorney who is violating the constitutional rights of the speedy trial of all New Yorkers, or whether you are somebody in a jail cell. We all know about what happened to Khalil. Dead for allegedly stealing a backpack and in prison for 3 years and never got a trial. India Cummings from my hometown of Buffalo, New York, 27-year-old African-American woman, arrested for a minor offense. We don't even know if she committed it. We will never know. Because days after being arrested and being held in the Erie County Holding Center, which is like the upstate version of Rikers Island, she was found dead on the floor in her own urine and in her own vomit. It is on us. It is on us that we have an unfair criminal justice system. But let me tell you, this is not rhetoric for me. This is my family's and my life's work. I was 7 years old during the Attica prison uprising in 1971. My father had conversed by paper, by letter with many inmates at Attica. And he was really the only legislator who took the time to respond to their concerns. He actually used to drive family members from Buffalo to Attica who didn't have cars so they could visit their loved ones who were in this maximum security prison. And so when the Attica prison uprising broke out, my father was one of the few people that the inmates asked to come and negotiate on their behalf. I was 7 years old at the time. Obviously, I didn't fully understand what was going on as a 7-year-old, but I later learned, just a few years later as a high school student, that my father walked into that prison without hesitation, not knowing whether he would come out alive. So when people talk about mass incarceration like it's a classroom talking point, I'm saying, who are you? And I'm referring specifically to Ms. Teachout, who went MIA on her client who was on death row in North Carolina and was sanctioned by the North Carolina bar for doing so, and who decided just 2 weeks ago to become a member of the New York bar. This is not a talking point for me. This is not a classroom exercise. It has been my family and my life's work.
All right now.
So the child that I was, when you're a 29-year-old lawyer, Michael, the extraordinary general counsel of NAN. You know, if you're not 30 years old and you're a lawyer, they call you a baby lawyer. Well, when I was a baby lawyer, I represented hundreds of women incarcerated in District of Columbia prisons. I took on the District of Columbia, and I fought and I won. That gives you a glimpse, just a glimpse, of the kind of baby lawyer I was, and just a taste of the kind of Attorney General I will be. Let me close by saying, before we turn it over to Q&A, which I'm happy to entertain, I talked about some of the issues that we're facing, and there are many of them. The opioid crisis, which is a crisis. And we need to deal with the opioid crisis in a way that we did not deal with the crack crisis. That we did not deal with the crack crisis. But, you know, here's an opportunity to get it right. To get it right. To not decriminalize mental health. To provide the opportunity for people, whether they've done time or have been addicted to drugs, to give them the right tools to help them turn their lives around once they have made the courageous step to get help, to get treatment. No New Yorker in this state who is addicted to drugs, whether it's crack, cocaine, or opioids, who has the courage to come forth and seek help, should be told there is no room at the inn, that you have to wait 6 months for treatment. We are better than that. We have led the suffrage movement. We have led the civil rights movement. We have led the LGBT movement. We have led the women's rights movement. And we need to lead the criminal justice movement, the educational opportunity movement, the economic development opportunity movement. We need to stand with our brothers and sisters so that they can use all the gifts that God has given them to maximize their full potential. That's the right thing to do, but frankly, it's the smart thing to do as well. One of the things that I'm most proud of that I worked on when I was with Hillary, and I was not a senior policy advisor to William Jefferson Clinton. I love him. I was a senior policy advisor to Hillary, and that is actually when I met some of the mothers of the movement, actually at a church in South Carolina some years ago. But one of the things I'm most proud of, and it doesn't deal with housing, it doesn't deal with immigration, but Hillary and I heard from so many women across the country, black women and white women and Latina and our Asian sisters as well. We heard from so many women who said, you know, when we see this bus of 3 women suffragettes, Elizabeth Cady Stanton among them, white women who did a lot to ensure that I, as a woman, would have my right to vote. But everybody kept asking, where's Sojourner Truth? Where's Sojourner Truth? Who gave that famous speech, ain't I a woman? What happened to me? Sojourner Truth, born Isabella Bumfree, born into slavery in rural New York State. One of the most extraordinary abolitionists of our time, and one of the most extraordinary suffragists of our time. And of all the things that I have done, in addition to representing successfully women prisoners, in addition to introducing or crafting legislation that Hillary introduced that is now the law of our nation, that has helped to transform lives, one of the things I'm most proud of is the legislation I crafted that Sheila Jackson Lee introduced in the House and that Hillary introduced in the Senate, that said we need to pay homage to this great American named Sojourner Truth. And today, for all of the world to see, when you walk not into the Russell Senate office building, not into a House of Representatives office building, when you walk into the rotunda, the center of the United States Capitol, Because of my work with Hillary and Sheila Jackson Lee, you will see for the first time in your lifetime a bust of a black woman named Sojourner Truth. In this race, I think about Sojourner, I think about Harriet Tubman, I think about Barbara Jordan, I think about Shirley Chisholm, never giving up, never giving up. Keep on going, because justice denied for one of us is justice denied for all of us. I know that you have some choices to make in this race. I know all the other candidates running, and they're good people. They're good people. It's a wonderful thing about our state that there are 3 women running.
Yes.
And one kind of relatively cool guy, but it's really fabulous that there are 3 women running. But these are extraordinarily serious times that require an unmatched, unwavering commitment and record in fighting and in winning. Time is too short. Our children, our families are waiting. They are waiting for someone to fight back against Donald Trump. They are waiting for this state to step up to make sure that they receive the promises and the opportunities that all children receive. And I stand before you as the person who is ready and most experienced and most able to lead that charge so that our state and every single community across it can be stronger and better than ever. Thank you so much. I would be honored to receive your vote. But whatever you do, I hope that you go and vote on September 13th. Thank you so very much.
Thank you for that most thorough and insightful presentation. There has been a consistent theme in many of the questions. We have been joined tonight by families of the movement, mothers and sisters and brothers and others. And this question actually comes from them. In almost every police killing case in New York over the past 2 decades, there are similar patterns. Even though there have been few convictions, officers who lied, leaking of sealed information related to the victims by police to try to justify the killing, and other misconduct that points to cover-ups. It's almost never just about one officer and their action. It always seems to be how the police department reacts to that officer's action to justify it. What would you do as Attorney General to bring greater accountability to police departments, not just not just in the context of the executive order which allowed the Attorney General to investigate the killing, but many officers lie, they commit perjury on their reports. There are other kinds of alleged crimes that cover up the initial killing. What would you do as Attorney General to broaden accountability and bring some of these other officers? For instance, with the killing of Eric Garner, we only have 2 officers who are facing any kind of administrative justice. One of them happened to be a black woman who wasn't there at the time. But the other officers who were on scene, none of them are facing any kind of administrative action. What would you do to expand and broaden accountability for police?
Thank you for that critically important question. I would do a number of things. First and foremost, advocate in the strongest way possible. And that's saying something, because there are very few things for which I advocate where I don't get what I'm advocating for, where I don't accomplish what I set out to do. A fierce advocate for the elimination of what we call 50A. It's a provision in state law that protects the disciplinary records from disclosure of police officers. And this is something that is almost unique to New York State and almost every other state in the country. If someone has been killed or even significantly physically harmed as a result of actions by police, whether someone thinks it was legitimate or not, that information is made public, and it is made public relatively quickly. Unfortunately, that is not the case in the state of New York, and that needs to change. Because as we all know, knowledge is power, and we are often too much in the dark. The families of the victims more than anyone. And so I would advocate aggressively for striking of that law in its entirety, so that any time a police officer is involved, not with just a shooting, but with the death under any circumstances. India Cummings wasn't shot, but she's dead. She's dead. Because corrections officers did not respond to someone who clearly was in a medical crisis. So anytime there is a death or even the physical harm causes someone, whether in a prison, jail, out on the street, as a result of the conduct by any law enforcement officer, cop on the street, or corrections officer, whether it's in Rikers or the Erie County Holding Center, their disciplinary record should be made public for all to see. And I say that saying, yes, you know, listen, the vast majority of police officers out there may be some brothers and sisters in the room who are police officers who risk their lives every day to keep us safe. And if they are involved with something and they don't have disciplinary problems, they should have no problem having their record exposed. It's the ones who got a problem who are doing everything possible to keep the record closed. But as Attorney General, in addition to that, whether or not the state legislature ever acts, and I believe that it will, and I certainly will do everything I can to make sure that that law is changed, I will use every tool, every investigative and prosecutorial tool available to me as the most fierce litigator in this race to investigate deaths of unarmed civilians, including getting access to all their disciplinary records, making those records public, and making sure that the officers are held to account. You know, the mayor of the city of New York, I mean, was playing this, I don't know what, for years, hiding behind a statute that really gave him some authority to make certain disciplinary records public, and he didn't do it. Finally, we are starting to see an investigative process underway, but justice is still denied for the Garner family and so many others. And so my efforts would be twofold. Fight to repeal 50A and use all the investigative and prosecutorial powers of the office to hold those in law enforcement to account.
Amen. Thank you.
Thank you. This next question was delivered very passionately earlier, but it's written down now. The campaign for fiscal equity, which was the lawsuit that was brought by advocates around education to bring money and fiscal equity down to our public schools, is grossly underfunded, and many believe that there's mismanagement in the school system, and many, quite frankly, just don't believe in mayoral control, which is not necessarily an AG thing. But in terms of the campaign for fiscal equity, what can you do, and in terms of accountability in the schools, what can you do to bring greater funding and bring greater justice in the funding formula if you can, and what will you do to bring greater accountability to the schools?
Well, thank you for whoever passionately asked that question. I talked about education because I'm the product of a quality public school education. And I would argue that there is not only a constitutional right, but there is a moral obligation to make sure that all of our children, regardless of their zip code and regardless of what they look like, have a sound basic education. So here are the facts. The Attorney General cannot usurp the authority of the state legislature and the governor that enact budgets. And those budgets are put together every year to provide for school funding. I don't know what other candidates have said to you, but the Attorney General represents state agencies, including state ed. And I have been asked by editorial boards, including the Albany Times Union, that unanimously endorsed my candidacy, and the Queens Tribune, that unanimously endorsed my candidacy. I've been asked them, well, you know what, you're the only candidate that talks about education, and you know, you've got a responsibility to represent state ed, so how are you going to deal with this? I said, listen, it is the job of the Attorney General to represent state agencies, but the ultimate responsibility of the Attorney General of this state is to do justice. And that is paramount. And one of the examples I gave them, which I think is analogous, is going back to the Attica prison uprising. There were prisoners who were killed, prison guards who were killed, prisoners who were maimed, prison guards who were maimed, as a result of the acts of the state of New York. It is not well known, but days after the Attica riots, state employees put documents in front of family members of prison guards, had them sign it, and they didn't know that they were signing away their right to seek full compensation from the state of New York. The state of New York did that. So yes, it is the obligation of the Attorney General of the state of New York to represent the state. But, as I said, it is ultimately the responsibility of the Attorney General to do justice. And years later, my father oversaw the hearings where he heard from the family members of those killed, both prisoners and guards, and played a central role in the state recognizing the injustice that it carried out that ultimately led to the Attorney General of the state of New York signing off on compensation for family members. It's not going to bring their loved ones back, but it is a recognition that the state conducted itself in an unjust way, and that the state itself had to be held to account. So fast forward to education. The Attorney General's job is not to engage in school funding formulas, but the state's highest court, the New York State Court of Appeals, held in the Campaign for Fiscal Equity that school funding was depriving children of their constitutional rights for funding. And if I determine as the Attorney General of the state of New York that any child in this state or school districts in this state are not providing a sound basic education, they will hear from me. And they may be upset because they may say, well, you know what? Attorney General Eve, you're supposed to be representing us. I said, no. My ultimate obligation under the state's constitution is to protect and defend the citizens, broadly defined, that's in the state's constitutions, its organizations, and its natural resources. So I would advocate for more funding. We have thousands of children across the city and across the state who are physically or mentally not fully able, who by admission of educational officials are not receiving a sound basic education to which they are entitled. Their civil rights are being violated. So there is unequivocally jurisdiction for me as the Attorney General of the state of New York to both investigate and ensure that these children's constitutional rights and their statutory rights to a sound basic education are in fact fulfilled.
Thank you for that. And the final question for you this evening is, we have been partnering with our sister organizations in civil rights as well as other advocacy groups, and this comes from one of the partners, Just Leadership USA. The concern and the question about community policing. We have been fighting National Action Network across the country for increased engagement, increased respect by police departments for the community that they serve, and a change away from the regressive policing models. And we have seen some embrace and some resist. As the Attorney General, what would you do as the Chief Law Enforcement Officer around the constitutional issues that community policing presents as juxtaposed to what we have been seeing, which is broken windows policing? What do you do? What would kind of vision as the Attorney General would you set for police departments and prosecutors around the state in terms of how to deal with communities of color and policing in general?
Thank you. I have a lot of experience with this issue as counsel to Joe Biden, who crafted legislation that became the law of the land that dealt with gun violence and violence of other kinds, although assault weapons ban unfortunately has since been expired. But what I learned from that experience, spending a lot of time with law enforcement, with NOBLE, the National Organizations of Blacks in Law Enforcement, and with their Latino brother organizations, as well as other organizations like the National Association of Police Organizations, that most law enforcement officers want to do the right thing. There's some bad apples there. And the persons who hate bad apples more than anyone else other than the victims of inappropriate or illegal conduct by law enforcement is a good cop. Because the good cops, the brothers and the sisters out there who do engage in appropriate community policing, who do abide by the rules, who do treat our community with respect, when the bad apples violate laws and engage in corrupt activity, it casts a mark on all of them. And so community policing, I believe, is a good thing when done right. When you're in the community, when it's not about broken brick windows, but when it's about engagement and mutual understanding and mutual respect. A sharp law enforcement officer is going to tell you the thing that she or he wants most is engagement with the community, because guess what? If a crime is committed against someone, you want that relationship because you want members of the community to feel that they can trust the people who are charged with protecting them, so that they can come forward and be in partnership and hold to account whoever may have committed the crime, typically against someone in our community. And so I believe that there is an important role for community policing. You know, what we do once a year, the National Night Out, should be once a year. In some communities, it should be once a month. In some communities, it needs to be once a week. But think about all of you who participated in the National Night Out with law enforcement. Think about the positive feeling that you had, the positive engagement that they had with us, and how we felt like, wow, there may be hope. There may be hope to have a positive, productive relationship with law enforcement in our community if it's done with mutual respect and mutual understanding. What we have, unfortunately, however, is people who are distorting what should be positive community policing, engaging in broken windows policies, and not treating every member of our community with respect and mutual understanding. But if we can do that, I believe that our communities are safer and stronger as a result of it. But it requires training of police. It requires training of police. It requires them understanding the communities that they're engaged with, and it requires, first and foremost, holding bad police officers who violate codes of conduct or who break the law fully to account.
Thank you. Did you want to make a quick closing, or?
I'll be brief.
Very brief? All right, thank you.
Well, first of all, thank you again, Reverend Sharpton, Minister Michael Hardy, and everyone for giving me the opportunity to speak. I hope that you will give all the candidates serious consideration, because this job is more important than it has ever been in my lifetime. The role of Attorney General is second only to Bob Mueller in terms of holding the President of the United States accountable. And you are looking at the person. You are looking at the person who is best prepared and most qualified. The fighter who knows how to not just fight, but win. Best prepared to hold him personally accountable. Best prepared to fight back against his policies. And best prepared to deal with the issues that are on us. Thank you so much for your consideration. I, with great humility and with much respect, as a neighbor of this community, living 6 blocks south of here, ask for you to believe in me. I ask you to believe in Eve. I will be humbled to be your next Attorney General of our great state. Thank you so very much, and God bless.
Give a hand. Our next candidate, first let me say that down through the years I've had different candidates that appeal to different things. But when I talked with Zeppa, she did a personal favor for me that she did not know. As most of you here now know, that I am in January expecting to be a grandfather. And going through this for the first time, every time I ask Dominique to do something she don't want to do, she talks about, well, I'm pregnant. Well, Zeppa came into office and she's running all over the state for governor pregnant. So I don't get nothing from Dominique right now. You got 1 point going for you, Zeppa, because now I got a pile of work for Dominique to do. And she can either do that or run from here through Albany and Buffalo and back. Zeppa Teachout is a professor of law at Fordham University.
That's right.
She won 34% of the vote when she ran for governor and upset New York State. When we talked, she said that we have met on several occasions, Reverend, but the one you probably will remember is I was there when y'all marched and stood up for Eric Garner in Staten Island. She was there as Eric's mother's behind her. So she has been an activist and has been a candidate that has brought out a surprising vote from a constituency that a lot of New York establishment did not know was there. I heard the other candidates say who they were endorsed by. She's been endorsed by everybody, from the New York Times to the Daily News to yesterday, Shirlane McCray, the First Lady of the city. All right. Let us welcome Professor of Law, candidate for Attorney General, Zeppa Teachout.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Reverend Sharpton. Thank you to the families who are here. Thank you to everyone at NAM. And thank you for giving me a little bit of your evening to talk about some of my plans as the next Attorney General of New York State. But first, I just want to tell you a little bit about myself. I grew up in the country, 5 miles from town. Our school bus wasn't a school bus, it was a station wagon, and they painted school bus on top of it. And we still had to walk a mile to get to it. uphill both ways. And I'm so sorry, Dominique, for the pain I have caused you. But I gotta tell you, when my husband asks me to do any chores around the house, I'm pregnant. I only have energy to run for Attorney General. So I went to college and then law school, and after law school, my first job was representing people on death row. At the time, I was working in North Carolina, and one of my first cases, just 2 months in, I was working with a team of lawyers, and they came to the Center for Death Penalty Litigation where I worked, and they had just gone to the governor of the state and asked that the death sentence, he'd gone through all his appeals, the client had gone through every appeal, and asked that the death sentence be commuted to life imprisonment without parole. And the governor turned them down. But here's the problem. The governor had been the prosecutor who had signed the initial papers seeking the death penalty in his case. So this is a very fundamental conflict of interest. And we wrote up some papers, and the lawyers took it to a judge who was eating dinner, and the judge listened to this case with a dog on his lap that night at 8:30 at night and said, this looks like an equal protection violation. If you're going to have a process where you get to ask for commuting a sentence, it has to be by somebody who hasn't already made up their mind that that person should be executed. So the judge stayed the execution. But then that night, in the middle of the night, the Supreme Court of North Carolina got together on the telephone. They didn't bother to have a full hearing. They didn't bother to come and read all the papers. They got together, and in a little over an hour on the telephone, they dissolved that stay. And so Clifton White, who had poison in his veins, as they were preparing his body to be executed by the state, was killed the next afternoon at 6 p.m. Now, I learned a lot that night, and I learned a lot in my years representing people on death row. I learned how careless and cruel law can be. I learned how the criminal justice system is built for people with a lot of money, but throws away and treats as less than human people who are poor, communities of color, people with debt, people with addiction problems. And I learned that law is not just a technical art, it is a moral art. And I will bring everything I learned there when I'm your next Attorney General. I'm not going to forget what I saw visiting jails and prisons and the obvious structural racism in our mass incarceration system. So I was born, you can look it up on Wikipedia, so I'm not telling you too much. I was born 46 years ago. 46 years ago, from 46 years ago to now, our incarcerated population has gone up 700%. 700%. We have, in this country, 25% of the incarcerated population of the entire world. That is wrong. And it's no mystery about why it started going up in 1970 after the success of the Civil Rights Movement. Because it was our governments figuring out a way to install the new Jim Crow and incarcerating people, particularly targeting communities of color. And when I of law, I think of the radical promise of law, and the radical promise of law is not our mass incarceration system. The radical promise of law is this idea that whoever you are, whatever the color of your skin, however much money you have, you are going to be treated equally under the law, and we know that is not happening right now. So what are we going to do about it? Well, we have to cut our incarcerated population in half by 2030 at least. And there's no excuses if we don't do that. Because if it can go up 700%, it can go down 700%. We have to end cash bail. You know, the fastest growing population in our incarcerated population is people who have never been found guilty of anything. They are sitting in cages because they don't have the money to pay for bail. That's not law, and that's not justice. And in New York State, we have some of the worst discovery laws in the country, which means you don't even have the right to know the witness statements against you. In Texas, you have the right to know the witness statements against you. Not in New York. So you are sitting in jail, not having been found guilty, not knowing the witness statements against you, with prosecutors who are abusing their power to lengthen out how long it takes to get to trial and coercing plea deals. That's wrong, and that is not justice. And when I'm the Attorney General of New York, we are not going to call that justice. So what are we going to do about it? One, fight for ending cash bail, fight for discovery reform, legalizing marijuana, working on reentry, second chance sentencing, because some of these sentences are way too long, and there are people who are in prison who have been there for 40 years under draconian sentencing policy, and we do not have to accept that that's the way it was. Actual parole reform. Number two, we need real police accountability. And that means expanding the executive order, that there's currently an executive order, and many of you in this room have fought hard for it, and thank you for your fighting, to give the Attorney General the authority to prosecute police violence in the case of quote-unquote unarmed civilians who are killed by the police. We have to expand that, because there's a basic problem here. Prosecutors aren't going after the police officers for illegal behavior. They work with them every day. How are we expecting that they're going to investigate them for lying in court? How do we expect that they're going to investigate them for brutality? So the executive order needs to be expanded to cover not just cases of quote-unquote unarmed civilians, but all deaths, and abuse, and rape, and lying. And we got to hold prosecutors accountable too. Do you know in New York State, we have some of the highest rates of exoneration because prosecutors withheld evidence? That is wrong. That is not law. So yes, thank you for those of you who fought for that commission, but I want authority in the AG's office where there isn't a conflict of interest to investigate misbehavior by prosecutors, and I want to use every power of investigation that we currently have to say, hey, I want to call out the DAs that are not doing good things and praise the DAs that are. When you have a DA in the Bronx where cases are 38% slower than anywhere else in the city, we have to call that out and say that's not okay. And that takes a lot of independence. That takes standing up to DAs who are a very powerful political force. It's something the Reverend has shown great leadership in. I'm done with my 15 minutes pretty soon. The last thing I want to talk about, and then I'll take your questions, is about, I want to talk about voting. All this is tied to voting. Voting is the basic right upon which all other rights depend. So after the Civil War, states started criminalizing all kinds of behavior and then taking away the right to vote from felons. Totally tied to each other. Taking away the right to vote from felons was part of voter suppression from the beginning. So I have been outspoken for years for universal voting. Everybody should be allowed to vote. Yes, parolees should be allowed to vote, but you shouldn't lose your right to vote when you go to prison in the first place. And I'm not talking about something that doesn't exist. It exists in 2 states, Maine and Vermont. 2 very white states. Let's have that in New York State. As you can see, I'm just getting started, but I'm taking up your time, so look, I am proud of the momentum my campaign has. I am proud of the support we have from across the board. I'm very independent. I'm ready to stand up to power. I'm an anti-corruption expert. And we have a big problem of money in politics in this country and in this state. I've been suing Donald Trump since 3 days after he took office. And I'm not about to stop. But I'm also not taking corporate money. Because I want to sue big corporations, not work for them. We have. I'm so honored to be with such brave people here tonight. I'm especially honored to be with the family members of people who have been killed, who have been real leaders, willing to be vulnerable in front of all New Yorkers, telling their stories and enacting real change. I'm honored to have the time to get to tell you a little bit about my story, a little bit about what I hope to do. And thank you. Hope you consider voting for me.
So we have a couple questions for you. You touched on a critical issue of justice for formerly incarcerated individuals, touching on the issue of voting, but there are other ways in which these formerly incarcerated individuals are discriminated against in housing and employment and every facet of society, education. Many are returning home, there's no support system, so they go back home to family members in NYCHA, or they go back where they know, and are putting some of their family members at risk of eviction by just going back home when they had no other option. What would you do as Attorney General to protect the families who are caring for these individuals who are coming home, who have no support system, no place to go, would wind up on the street or in a shelter or back in the system? How do you plan to, what's your vision to protect that community of vulnerable individuals who are, experiencing discrimination in every step of the way?
Well, a key part of thank you for the question. A key part of the Attorney General's job is to be protecting people's basic rights and making sure they are not illegally discriminated against, pushing for expanding our anti-discrimination laws. But this is something that, I'm glad you raised the issue, because re-entry is one of the issues I think a lot of people just don't know enough about at all. That re-entry is a huge challenge. And we basically kick people out, 2 years, 5 years, 20 years, 34 years, incarcerated, and say, there you are, without anything on the street, go fend for yourself. You may not know how to use a cell phone, and you certainly can't afford a cell phone, and just go figure it out. So it's basically setting people up on a chute to come right back into prison. And we can't do that. So one thing that we have in our reform proposal is, first off, just doing a basic shine the light report on reentry, on what's actually happening with reentry. Because one of the great powers of the Attorney General's office is to shine the light. We haven't used enough. It's been since 1998. Elliot Spitzer did a stop and frisk report. It's been 20 years since we've done a full report there. So when it comes to reentry, making sure that we shine a light on what's happening, encouraging, providing the resources so that people are not left basically to just shoot right back into the criminal justice system. So thank you for the question.
Thank you. I'm sorry. We have this question, which we have been, this issue has been resurfacing over and over again. It's a constant theme. This one in particular is coming from a NAN Youth Huddle member, and they're concerned, they're raising the issue of lead poisoning in NYCHA. One of the other candidates mentioned that indeed we see it in NYCHA, but this is an issue that is reoccurring across the state in communities in public housing and communities not in public housing. And we've not seen the kind of enforcement of environmental laws. What would you do as Attorney General to protect those communities that are vulnerable to things like lead poisoning and other, chemical, everything else that's out there that's, that's creeping into our daily lives and choking the life out of many of our neighbors?
I mean, these stories are horrifying. They're just disgusting. We're poisoning our kids. We're poisoning our kids. And there are a lot of different people who are responsible. And they all have to be held accountable. So one, looking into violations of our environmental laws, of our civil rights laws. But two, there are companies that were responsible for the lead testing here. They're contractors. And you always have to follow the money. And again, I don't take corporate money. So investigating those contractors about what they knew and when they knew it. Looking at the cover-up of what they knew and when they knew it. But you talked about a broader issue here, which is about environmental justice. Because we all know that polluters dump in communities of color. We know that. When you go to Newburgh, the Department of Defense puts toxic firefighting foam into the water supply, poisoning the kids in Newburgh. So we have not done enough. We have not done enough. I, as Attorney General, want to sue the Department of Defense until they pay back everything they owe to the community of Newburgh. And I gotta be frank with you, that requires speaking up and telling the governor when I want him to do something he hasn't done. And you know I'll do that. Because the Attorney General's office needs a referral from the Department of Environmental Conservation to be able to go after the environmental misdeeds in Newburgh with the DOD. So there are powers that haven't been used that I will use, because we are talking about poisoning our kids, our air, our health, our soil. And a state that poisons its soil, its air, its water, poisons itself, and we're not going to allow that to happen.
Well, thank you. As a quick kind of follow-up to that, we in the past year at National Action Network have been dealing with this very issue, and there was several polluters in Brooklyn One of them, we actually went out to the site. They had a massive fire which shut down the Long Island Railroad, chemical fire that spewed. The fumes took chemicals and dumped it across the surrounding community, which happened to be Canarsie and Flatbush. Brooklyn Resource Recovery. There has been no investigation. The Department of Buildings, there's been no action there. As Attorney General, would you work with communities that are dealing on the front lines with these issues, whether it be environmental justice or police accountability? Will you work with communities like organizations like National Action Network and NAACP and Just Leadership USA and CPR and Urban League on these kinds of issues? Because we really cannot afford to have an ivory tower kind of an Attorney General in this day and age. How accessible will you be after the election to us?
Absolutely yes. And what I've been doing in the 4 years since I ran for governor is being out there, talking to people, listening to their stories, engaging. That's just who I am. And we're talking about taking on some of the most powerful interests in world history.
All right, come on.
Talk about it.
We're talking about taking on some of the most powerful corporations in world history.
Then go right there.
And if we're taking on a culture of fear and bigotry and big money, we can't afford to do it alone. And think that any one person or even any one office of 700 people can do it alone. We have to take on their fear and big money with community and love. And so a key part of all our proposals is greater community engagement. Everything. Because communities know all the secrets. You know, when it comes to housing, which is something I care so much about, who do you think knows the most about tenant harassment? Tenants! So if you're sitting and not engaging with tenant groups, you aren't going to know what's actually happening. And then when you get that big settlement because there's been illegal tenant harassment, you aren't going to know where that settlement money should go. So beginning to end of investigations have to start in communities because that's where the wisdom is. People on their own know one piece of the elephant, right? But when we all come together, we see it's an elephant. So that's the way that I see the job.
I hate to do it, but I'm going to give you one last question because you're just so dynamite at them. And this is a question that is a particular sensitivity. You know, many of us who are in the criminal justice reform movement, police accountability movement, know that corruption doesn't just hide behind a uniform. It also hides behind the prosecutor's desks. And in Brooklyn, we've seen with the late, great District Attorney Ken Thompson, the establishment of a bureau to investigate the corruption from the administration prior. That has been kind of isolated to Brooklyn, but we do have a need for broader and greater accountability even among the prosecutors in the 60 some odd counties across the state. What as Attorney General would you do to create a standard, raise the standard, espouse a standard of ethical behavior, non-discriminatory behavior, and how do you get these prosecutors to go back into their own closets and free those hundreds and thousands of people that we all know are unjustly incarcerated today in New York State? What would you do as Attorney General to help bring some of those people home and create a new, better standard for prosecutors around the state?
So when I was working as a death penalty lawyer at the Center for Death Penalty Litigation, I met men who had spent the bulk of their lives behind bars, unjustly convicted. It is one of the worst things that we as a society can do, and we have to acknowledge that, not hide from it. And at every level, make sure that justice is done, not close the books, but open the books.
All right.
So prosecutorial accountability across the board is really important, and there's different parts of it. One is the Misconduct Commission, which we talked about earlier, and as I said, I think that's not enough. The Attorney General should also have the ability to investigate misconduct among prosecutors. I think that's really important. Number two, you want to know reports. You want to know which DAs are slowing down cases. You want to know what DAs' practices are. Because when we know, then we can move towards reform. You know, as Gandhi said, what happens if you first tell the truth? The truth can be a big thing and can move the state. So making sure that there's highlighting what is actually happening and the kinds of practices that lead to malpractice is critical. And the second, and finally, is that, you know, if somebody has been unjustly incarcerated in our state, we owe them full attention, cooperation, to work with them, to understand what that has meant to their lives. Again, I'm going to end where I started. I'm going to end where I started. Your first job puts a stamp on you. You learn so much. I learned from representing the most hated people in society. I saw what happens when prosecutors are careless and then want to hide it. I am not going to stand for that being the standard in New York. We should be leading the country, not number 4 at the back of the pack when it comes to prosecutorial misconduct leading to false imprisonment, to wrongful convictions. And we should be proud of where we get to, because we are not proud of where we are right now. We're facing a genuine, Donald Trump is a horror. He's literally tearing apart families, right? But we in New York have to be the living counterexample to that. We have to show what justice actually looks like in this state. We have to show what it looks like when we actually cut our incarcerated population in half. We have to show what it looks like when DAs are not abusing their power, but actually using it justly. And I see this as a legal job and an organizing job, and I'm willing to go to the wall for both. Thank you so much.
We started at 6 and said we'd be out 8:15. All the candidates to come on time. Minister Floyd confirmed all of them to be on time. He got a text from Sean saying that they were delayed, couldn't get it to 8:45 or 9. So I told him I'm not gonna hold people to wait. He'll have to come at another time. People should make sure they show up in there on time. So I'm overruling the young folks and saying thank you for coming and good night.